My father shoved me away from my own birthday cake so his favorite daughter could pose for the cameras. "Guests of value go first," he sneered, leaving me bleeding against a glass table. The ballroom went quiet. Then the celebrity chef hired for the night slammed his silver knife onto the cutting block. "Sir," the chef announced to the silent room, "the food preservation technology you are pitching to these investors was invented by the woman you just pushed." My father turned the color of ash. But before he could muster a response, my phone vibrated with a message that turned a humiliating party into a race against death. The crystal chandeliers in the Ritz-Carlton ballroom cast a harsh glare over the tiered vanilla cake. It was supposed to be a celebration of my 31st birthday. Instead, my father, Richard Kensington, had hijacked the venue. He packed the guest list with venture capitalists, turning my milestone into a desperate pitch to save his sinking hotel conglomerate. I reached for the silver cake knife resting on the linen tablecloth. Before my fingers could touch the handle, a heavy hand gripped my shoulder. Richard shoved me backward. My heels slipped on the polished marble. I stumbled, crashing hard against a high-top glass table. The sharp, beveled edge sliced through the fabric of my dress, biting deep into my lower back. I tasted copper as my teeth clamped down on the inside of my cheek. "Guests of value go first. Not you," my father muttered, his voice a low rasp, meant only for me. "Do not get in your sister's way." He smoothed the lapels of his custom tuxedo and turned his back on me. My older sister Vanessa glided past me in a ruby silk evening gown. She did not even glance at the blood pooling on my skin. She stepped up to the cake, flashing a practiced, radiant smile for the flashing cameras of the investors. She held the knife, lifting it high as if the entire evening was her triumph. I pressed my palm against the cut on my back, feeling the warm dampness soak into my skin. I did not cry. I did not shout. I stood in the shadow of the ice sculpture, watching my family steal my air. A loud metallic crack shattered the refined hum of the ballroom. Julian Rossi, the Michelin-starred executive chef hired to cater the event, dropped his heavy carving knife onto the oak block. He untied his apron and stepped out from behind the carving station. His dark eyes locked onto my father. The room fell into a dead hush. The venture capitalists lowered their champagne flutes. Mr. Kensington Julian said, his voice carrying the weight of a seasoned kitchen commander, "You have spent the last hour boasting to these investors about the revolutionary nitrogen preservation technology, keeping tonight's menu fresh. You claimed it is your company's proprietary innovation." Richard puffed out his chest, offering a tight diplomatic smile. "Julian, this is a private family moment. Return to your station." Julian did not retreat. He pointed a scarred finger directly at me, standing bleeding near the glass table. "That technology does not belong to your hotel group, Richard. The algorithm, the chemical patents, and every single item on this menu were designed by the woman you just threw into a table." The silence in the ballroom deepened, turning suffocating. The investors exchanged sharp, calculating glances. Vanessa froze, the silver knife trembling in her grip. Richard's face morphed from a confident bronze to a sickly pale white. He opened his mouth to spin a lie to salvage the pitch, but his leverage was gone. The investors were looking at him not as a visionary, but as a fraud. Before Richard could attempt damage control, my phone vibrated in my pocket. The harsh buzz broke the tension in my mind. I pulled the device out and glanced at the screen. It was a text from David. David is my brother-in-law, a razor-sharp African-American financial defense attorney who treats legal codes like weapons. He rarely texted unless a situation was critical. I read the message. My lungs stopped working. "Clara, get to the hospital right now. Your father just emptied the escrow account holding your mother's heart surgery fund." I stared at the glowing words. The sting in my back faded, replaced by an icy, consuming dread. Richard had not just stolen my intellectual property for a pitch. He had stolen my mother's life support. I looked up from the screen. My father was still standing near the cake, trying to pacify the murmuring investors. He thought he was dealing with an embarrassed daughter. He had no idea he had just ignited a war. I turned my back on the ballroom and broke into a sprint toward the exit. "My name is Clara. I am 31 years old and the silent architect behind a multi-million-dollar food technology startup. Before I tell you how I dismantled my father's hospitality empire piece by piece, Let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you believe arrogant men always dig their own graves. The rain hit the windshield in heavy, unrelenting sheets as I drove across downtown Boston. I ignored the red traffic lights, keeping my foot pressed hard against the accelerator. My mind raced through the financial data. My mother needed a complex heart valve replacement by Friday morning. The family escrow account held $300,000 designated exclusively for her medical expenses. I had funded 70% of that account through my own independent consulting contracts. Richard acted as the sole custodian. David's text message confirmed Richard drained the balance. I swerved my car into the loading zone in front of the Kensington Hospitality Tower. The building stood 50 stories high, a glass and steel monument to my father's inflated ego. I had personally built the logistical infrastructure that kept this tower operating. I marched through the revolving doors. The lobby was deserted except for the night security desk. I bypassed the turnstiles, stepping into the private executive elevator. My breathing was ragged. The deep cut on my lower back throbbed with a sharp burning heat every time I shifted my weight. I watched the digital floor indicator climb to the penthouse level. I prepared myself to confront Richard and force him to transfer the funds back to the hospital. The elevator doors parted. The penthouse hallway was lined with oil portraits of Richard shaking hands with local politicians. I reached his office at the far end of the corridor. The heavy mahogany door was shut tight. I did not knock. I lifted my foot and kicked the door right above the brass handle. The latch gave way with a loud crack. The door swung open and slammed against the interior wall. I stepped inside, ready to demand the routing numbers. Richard was not there. Sitting in my father-oversized leather executive chair, with her bare feet propped on his desk, was Vanessa. She had beaten me here from the hotel ballroom. She wore the same ruby silk evening gown, now slightly wrinkled. She held a crystal flute of vintage champagne, taking a slow, deliberate sip. She did not flinch when the door slammed open. She expected my arrival. "You took the scenic route, Clara," she noted, her tone laced with sheer boredom. I marched toward the desk. "Where's the money, Vanessa? Mom is scheduled for pre-op admission tomorrow morning." Vanessa sighed, lowering her glass to the desk blotter. Always so dramatic. She reached beside her and picked up a thick legal binder bound in dark blue leather. She tossed it casually across the desk. It slid over the polished wood and fell onto the floor near my feet. I looked down. The cover bore the official seal of the United States Patent and Trademark Office. I bent down and picked it up. It was not a medical file or a bank statement. It was the registration paperwork for the nitrogen preservation algorithm, my algorithm. I had spent 3 years in a windowless laboratory coding the thermal distribution metrics and running food spoilage simulations to perfect that system. I missed holidays. I slept under my desk eating cold takeout. I flipped open the heavy cover and turned to the primary filing page. The applicant listed as the sole creator and owner was Vanessa Kensington. "What is this?" I demanded, the paper trembling in my grip. "You do not even know how to write a basic line of code. You cannot even install a software update on your phone." Vanessa swung her legs off the desk and stood up, smoothing the front of her dress. "I know how to hire people who do. You asked where the surgery money went. You are holding the receipt." The cold reality washed over me, turning my blood to ice. "You stole the surgical fund to pay lawyers?" I asked, the sickness spreading through my stomach. "Yes, Clara," she replied, her voice devoid of any human empathy. "Top-tier intellectual property attorneys are expensive. We needed them to scrub your digital footprint from the development servers and rush the patent transfer into my name. It cost $300,000. We considered it a necessary business expense. You sacrificed her life for a patent." I stepped closer, my fists clenched tight. "Why?" "Because our father is broke," Vanessa stated, leaning over the desk, her eyes narrowing. "The hotel group is drowning in bad commercial debt. The board of directors is preparing to oust him by the end of the quarter. We needed a lifeline. OmniCorp is looking to acquire a hospitality brand with advanced supply chain tech. They offered $50 million for Kensington Hospitality, but the offer is contingent on us owning your little food preservation system. We cannot sell the company if an ungrateful daughter holds the underlying intellectual property rights. So we fixed the problem. I am the inventor now. The acquisition signs on Monday morning." The depravity of her confessions suffocated the air in the room. They traded their own wife and mother for a corporate bailout. They stole my life work to fund their survival. I slammed my hands onto the desk, leaning inches from her face. "You will never close that deal," I promised, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "I have the raw source code. I have the server timestamps. I will torch this entire building before I let you sell my work to OmniCorp." I reached across the desk to grab the original patent folder sitting near her champagne glass. I needed the filing identification numbers to issue an immediate legal injunction. Vanessa did not panic. She pressed a concealed panic button mounted under the lip of the desk. In less than 10 seconds, the heavy office door swung open. 4 private security guards wearing dark tactical suits rushed into the room. I knew these men. I had upgraded their surveillance software last year. "Ma'am, step away from the desk." The lead guard ordered, his hand resting on his utility belt. I grabbed the folder. "She stole this," I told them. "Get out of my way." The guards did not hesitate. Richard paid their salaries. 2 of them lunged forward, grabbing my wrists. They twisted my arms behind my back, forcing my shoulders to strain. The sharp movement stretched the cut on my spine, sending a fresh wave of blinding pain through my body. I gasped, dropping the folder onto the carpet. "Get this trash out of my office," Vanessa instructed, turning her back to look out the floor-to-ceiling window at the city skyline. "If she tries to re-enter the premises, treat her as a hostile intruder." The guards forced me toward the door. I dug my heels into the carpet, resisting the physical force. "You are signing your own death warrant, Vanessa," I shouted, as they hauled me into the corridor. The guards dragged me toward the service elevator. Their grips were like iron bands digging into my skin. The pain in my back radiated down my legs with every step. We descended 50 floors in silence. The metal doors opened to the loading dock. The night shift employees watched, carrying boxes and pushing carts, as the CEO daughter was marched out like a common criminal. The lead guard shoved me forward. I lost my footing and fell hard onto the wet concrete of the loading dock alleyway. The rain poured down, soaking my torn dress and mixing with the blood seeping from my back. "Do not come back," Miss Kensington, the guard warned, pulling the heavy steel roll-up door shut. The lock engaged with a loud metallic clank echoing in the dark street. I lay on the cold, wet pavement. The city rain battered my face. The physical agony was intense, but it was eclipsed by the betrayal. They had drained my mother heart surgery fund. They had stolen my intellectual property. They had ordered armed men to throw me into the street. A normal person would break down. A normal person would sit in the rain and weep at the unfairness of the world. I did not shed a single tear. I pushed myself up onto my hands and knees. The cold water numbed my skin. I stood up slowly, ignoring the sting in my spine. I looked at the towering Kensington building stretching into the dark sky. They thought they had neutralized a threat. They thought dragging me out the back door secured their $50 million payout. They did not understand the mind of the woman who built their logistical empire. I brushed the wet hair from my face. My eyes hardened into cold steel. They took my mother's heartbeat. I was going to stop theirs. I stood in the dark alleyway behind the Kensington building, wiping the grit and rainwater from my knees. The cut on my back stung with every sharp breath, but the physical pain was irrelevant. I needed a plan. I needed to freeze the OmniCorp acquisition before Monday morning. I took a step toward the main avenue, preparing to walk the 3 miles to my apartment to access my secure servers. A pair of bright halogen headlights cut through the heavy downpour. A sleek black luxury SUV turned sharply into the narrow loading dock alleyway. The tires screeched against the wet concrete, stopping inches from where I stood. The driver's side door opened. David stepped out into the rain. David was a senior partner at a formidable corporate defense firm in Boston. He married my older sister Elise 5 years ago. While the rest of the Kensington family operated on emotion, entitlement, and appearances, David operated purely on data. He was a legal surgeon dissecting corporate structures and burying financial liabilities for multinational conglomerates. He did not engage in the petty family drama. He watched from the perimeter, collecting intelligence. He walked around the front of the SUV holding a heavy wool trench coat. He did not ask if I was all right. He did not offer empty sympathies regarding my mother. He simply draped the dry coat over my shivering shoulders. "I checked the escrow logs 10 minutes ago," David stated, his deep, resonant voice slicing through the noise of the rain. The surgical funds were wired to an offshore legal retainer account, matching the firm representing Vanessa patent application. Richard is accelerating his timeline. I pulled the coat tight around me, the warmth a sharp contrast to the biting cold. They are selling the company to OmniCorp, David. They stole my algorithm to sweeten the deal. They traded Mom Life for a $50 million buyout. I need to file an emergency injunction on Monday morning to block the intellectual property transfer. David shook his head, raindrops catching in his close-cropped hair. He did not look like a man preparing to file standard legal motions. He looked like a general surveying a battlefield. He walked to the back of his SUV and popped the trunk. He pulled out a rugged, encrypted laptop and set it directly onto the wet hood of the vehicle, shielding the screen with his body. An injunction will take 48 hours to process. David set his fingers moving rapidly across the keyboard. By then, OmniCorp will have absorbed the intellectual property and buried it under a mountain of corporate red tape. You will spend 10 years litigating the patent in federal court. Richard is not selling the company to expand his legacy. Clara, he is selling the company because he is bleeding out. David turned the laptop screen toward me. The bright glow illuminated the dark alley. Look at this ledger, David instructed, pointing to a column of highlighted red figures. I leaned in, squinting through the rain. The document displayed a complex web of high-interest bridge loans and leveraged assets. The primary lender was not a traditional commercial bank. It was a private, aggressive equity fund, known for funding desperate ventures and enforcing brutal collection terms. Your father is severely underwater. David continued, his tone analytical and cold. The pandemic restrictions crushed his commercial occupancy rates. Instead of downsizing, he maintained the luxury facade by borrowing $20 million from a shadow equity group to cover his operating losses. The entire Kensington hospitality portfolio, including your family estate, is pledged as collateral. The realization hit me hard. The $50 million OmniCorp buyout was not a strategic expansion. It was a ransom payment. The principal balance is due in full on Tuesday morning, David explained, closing a window on the screen and opening another. The shadow fund is preparing to execute a hostile takeover of all his assets if he defaults. If Richard does not walk into the OmniCorp signing ceremony on Monday and present the acquisition contract as a guarantee, he loses the hotels. He loses the estate. Your mother will be removed from her medical care facility and placed in a state-run ward by Wednesday. The anger I felt toward Richard mutated into something darker and more precise. He was not just an arrogant thief. He was a desperate gambler trying to use my brilliance to cover his catastrophic failures. I was throwing my mother on the fire to keep his own hands warm. We have to expose the debt to OmniCorp, I said, formulating a counterattack. If OmniCorp knows Richard is on the verge of total default, they will pull their offer. They will not buy a company tied to predatory equity funds. David offered a sharp, humorless smile. You are thinking like an engineer, Clara. You want to break the machine. You need to think like a corporate raider. You need to own the machine. He tapped a key on his laptop, pulling up a final document. It bore the official seal of the Securities and Exchange Commission, detailing commercial debt transfers. Shadow equity funds hate risk. David continued, the rain soaking through his custom suit. When they realized Richard was desperate enough to steal his own daughter intellectual property to secure a sale, they classified his debt as highly toxic. They wanted to offload the $20 million note before he defaulted and dragged them into a lengthy bankruptcy proceeding. They bundled the debt and sold it on the secondary market at a massive discount yesterday afternoon. Who bought it? I asked, staring at the screen. If OmniCorp bought the debt, they already own the company. David hit a final key, zooming in on the assignee line of the debt transfer document. The name of the new primary creditor, the entity that now held the $20 million mortgage on Richard's entire empire, was displayed in crisp black text. I read the name. My breath hitched in my throat. I looked up at David, the rain washing the blood and dirt from my face. Apex Holdings. I whispered the name of the LLC, staring back at me. David nodded, his eyes locked onto mine with intense predatory approval. You established Apex Holdings 3 years ago as a blind shell company to hold the royalties from your early software consulting contracts. It is entirely anonymous. Richard has no idea you operate it. When the shadow fund listed his debt on the dark market, I used my proxy access to authorize the purchase through Apex. I stared at the screen, processing the sheer magnitude of the maneuver. David had not just found a legal loophole. He had quietly positioned me as the apex predator in Richard's financial ecosystem. You bought his debt, I said, the reality settling over me. David closed the laptop with a decisive snap. I secured the bridge loan against your projected royalty earnings and acquired the note for $12 million. You are no longer his victim, Clara. You are his primary creditor. You own the $20 million mortgage on Kensington Hospitality. The cold rain did not bother me anymore. The physical pain in my back faded into insignificance. The power dynamic had inverted with violent suddenness. Richard thought he was selling my life work to save his company. He did not know I currently held the deed to his company in my pocket. If Richard fails to secure the OmniCorp deal on Monday, David stated, packing the laptop back into the trunk, he defaults on the loan. If he defaults, you hold the unilateral right to execute an immediate foreclosure on all Kensington assets. You take the hotels. You take the estate. You wipe him out completely. But he still has the patent. I argued, the strategic puzzle reforming in my mind. He is going to walk into the country club tomorrow morning to finalize the terms with the OmniCorp executives. If they like what they see, he gets the $50 million. He pays off the debt to Apex Holdings, and he walks away clean with my algorithm. David closed the trunk of the SUV. He turned to face me, the streetlights reflecting in his dark eyes. Then you must ensure the OmniCorp executives do not like what they see tomorrow. You must break the deal before it reaches the signing table on Monday. He opened the passenger door of the SUV. Get in. We need to secure your mother a private surgical team immediately using the Apex operational accounts. Tomorrow morning you are going to the country club. You are going to look the OmniCorp executives in the eye, and you are going to dismantle your father illusion piece by piece. I climbed into the warm leather interior of the SUV. The scent of rain and expensive cologne filled the cabin. I looked out the window at the towering Kensington building. Richard believed he had discarded a nuisance into the alleyway. He did not realize he had just handed a loaded weapon to the architect who built his empire. The war was no longer about survival. It was about total annihilation. I stood in the dark alleyway behind the Kensington building, wiping the grit and rainwater from my knees. The cut on my back stung with every sharp breath, but the physical pain was irrelevant. I needed a plan. I needed to freeze the OmniCorp acquisition before Monday morning. I took a step toward the main avenue, preparing to walk the 3 miles to my apartment to access my secure servers. A pair of bright halogen headlights cut through the heavy downpour. A sleek black luxury SUV turned sharply into the narrow loading dock alleyway. The tires screeched against the wet concrete, stopping inches from where I stood. The driver's side door opened. David stepped out into the rain. David was a senior partner at a formidable corporate defense firm in Boston. He married my older sister Elise 5 years ago. While the rest of the Kensington family operated on emotion, entitlement, and appearances, David operated purely on data. He was a legal surgeon dissecting corporate structures and burying financial liabilities for multinational conglomerates. He did not engage in the petty family drama. He watched from the perimeter, collecting intelligence. He walked around the front of the SUV holding a heavy wool trench coat. He did not ask if I was all right. He did not offer empty sympathies regarding my mother. He simply draped the dry coat over my shivering shoulders. I checked the escrow logs 10 minutes ago, David stated, his deep, resonant voice slicing through the noise of the rain. The surgical funds were wired to an offshore legal retainer account matching the firm representing Vanessa patent application. Richard is accelerating his timeline. I pulled the coat tight around me, the warmth a sharp contrast to the biting cold. They are selling the company to OmniCorp, David. They stole my algorithm to sweeten the deal. They traded Mom Life for a $50 million buyout. I need to file an emergency injunction on Monday morning to block the intellectual property transfer. David shook his head, raindrops catching in his close-cropped hair. He did not look like a man preparing to file standard legal motions. He looked like a general surveying a battlefield. He walked to the back of his SUV and popped the trunk. He pulled out a rugged, encrypted laptop and set it directly onto the wet hood of the vehicle, shielding the screen with his body. An injunction will take 48 hours to process. David said, his fingers moving rapidly across the keyboard. By then, OmniCorp will have absorbed the intellectual property and buried it under a mountain of corporate red tape. You will spend 10 years litigating the patent in federal court. Richard is not selling the company to expand his legacy, Clara. He is selling the company because he is bleeding out. David turned the laptop screen toward me. The bright glow illuminated the dark alley. "Look at this ledger," David instructed, pointing to a column of highlighted red figures. I leaned in, squinting through the rain. The document displayed a complex web of high-interest bridge loans and leveraged assets. The primary lender was not a traditional commercial bank. It was a private, aggressive equity fund known for funding desperate ventures and enforcing brutal collection terms. "Your father is severely underwater." David continued, his tone analytical and cold. "The pandemic restrictions crushed his commercial occupancy rates. Instead of downsizing, he maintained the luxury facade by borrowing $20 million from a shadow equity group to cover his operating losses. The entire Kensington hospitality portfolio, including your family estate, is pledged as collateral." The realization hit me hard. The $50 million OmniCorp buyout was not a strategic expansion. It was a ransom payment. "The principal balance is due in full on Tuesday morning," David explained, closing a window on the screen and opening another. "The shadow fund is preparing to execute a hostile takeover of all his assets if he defaults. If Richard does not walk into the OmniCorp signing ceremony on Monday and present the acquisition contract as a guarantee, he loses the hotels. He loses the estate. Your mother will be removed from her medical care facility and placed in a state-run ward by Wednesday." The anger I felt toward Richard mutated into something darker and more precise. He was not just an arrogant thief. He was a desperate gambler trying to use my brilliance to cover his catastrophic failures. He was throwing my mother on the fire to keep his own hands warm. "We have to expose the debt to OmniCorp," I said, formulating a counterattack. "If OmniCorp knows Richard is on the verge of total default, they will pull their offer. They will not buy a company tied to predatory equity funds." David offered a sharp, humorless smile. "You are thinking like an engineer, Clara. You want to break the machine. You need to think like a corporate raider. You need to own the machine." He tapped a key on his laptop, pulling up a final document. It bore the official seal of the Securities and Exchange Commission detailing commercial debt transfers. "Shadow equity funds, hate risk." David continued, the rain soaking through his custom suit. "When they realized Richard was desperate enough to steal his own daughter intellectual property to secure a sale, they classified his debt as highly toxic. They wanted to offload the $20 million note before he defaulted and dragged them into a lengthy bankruptcy proceeding. They bundled the debt and sold it on the secondary market at a massive discount yesterday afternoon. "Who bought it?" I asked, staring at the screen. "If OmniCorp bought the debt, they already own the company." David hit a final key, zooming in on the assignee line of the debt transfer document. The name of the new primary creditor, the entity that now held the $20 million mortgage on Richard's entire empire, was displayed in crisp black text. I read the name. My breath hitched in my throat. I looked up at David, the rain washing the blood and dirt from my face. Apex Holdings. I whispered the name of the LLC, staring back at me. David nodded, his eyes locked onto mine with intense predatory approval. "You established Apex Holdings 3 years ago as a blind shell company to hold the royalties from your early software consulting contracts. It is entirely anonymous. Richard has no idea you operate it. When the shadow fund listed his debt on the dark market, I used my proxy access to authorize the purchase through Apex." I stared at the screen, processing the sheer magnitude of the maneuver. David had not just found a legal loophole. He had quietly positioned me as the apex predator in Richard's financial ecosystem. "You bought his debt," I said, the reality settling over me. David closed the laptop with a decisive snap. "I secured the bridge loan against your projected royalty earnings and acquired the note for $12 million. You are no longer his victim, Clara. You are his primary creditor. You own the $20 million mortgage on Kensington Hospitality." The cold rain did not bother me anymore. The physical pain in my back faded into insignificance. The power dynamic had inverted with violent suddenness. Richard thought he was selling my life work to save his company. He did not know I currently held the deed to his company in my pocket. "If Richard fails to secure the OmniCorp deal on Monday," David stated, packing the laptop back into the trunk, "he defaults on the loan. If he defaults, you hold the unilateral right to execute an immediate foreclosure on all Kensington assets. You take the hotels, you take the estate, you wipe him out completely. But he still has the patent," I argued, the strategic puzzle reforming in my mind. He is going to walk into the country club tomorrow morning to finalize the terms with the OmniCorp executives. If they like what they see, he gets the $50 million. He pays off the debt to Apex Holdings, and he walks away clean with my algorithm. David closed the trunk of the SUV. He turned to face me, the streetlights reflecting in his dark eyes. Then you must ensure the OmniCorp executives do not like what they see tomorrow. You must break the deal before it reaches the signing table on Monday. He opened the passenger door of the SUV. Get in. We need to secure your mother a private surgical team immediately using the Apex operational accounts. Tomorrow morning you are going to the country club. You are going to look the OmniCorp executives in the eye, and you are going to dismantle your father illusion piece by piece. I climbed into the warm leather interior of the SUV. The scent of rain and expensive cologne filled the cabin. I looked out the window at the towering Kensington building. Richard believed he had discarded a nuisance into the alleyway. He did not realize he had just handed a loaded weapon to the architect who built his empire. The war was no longer about survival. It was about total annihilation. The morning sun glared off the pristine, manicured greens of the Kensington Country Club. The air smelled of freshly cut grass and entitlement. I parked my unremarkable sedan in the overflow lot, a stark contrast to the line of Bentleys and Porsches near the clubhouse entrance. David needed 48 hours to execute the complex financial maneuvers required to finalize the Apex Holdings debt acquisition. He needed to ensure Richard could not uncover the identity of his new creditor before the trap snapped shut. My assignment was simple. Infiltrate the preliminary meeting between Richard and OmniCorp, stall the negotiations, and maintain the illusion of compliance. I walked toward the clubhouse terrace where the private breakfast meeting was taking place. My back throbbed a dull, persistent ache from the glass table the night before, carefully bandaged beneath a crisp white button-down shirt. I did not walk with the posture of a defeated daughter. I walked with the calculated precision of an auditor inspecting a failing asset. I spotted them at a prime table overlooking the 18th hole. Richard wore a tailored linen suit, laughing expansively at a joke made by the OmniCorp CEO. Vanessa sat beside him, wearing a designer pastel sundress, playing the role of the brilliant young inventor. They were surrounded by 4 OmniCorp executives in sharp business attire, reviewing the preliminary acquisition documents. Richard saw me approach. The jovial smile vanished instantly, replaced by a flash of genuine panic, followed quickly by a hardened, lethal glare. He excused himself from the table and intercepted me near the service station out of earshot of the executives. "What are you doing here?" he hissed, grabbing my arm tightly enough to leave bruises. "I told security to ban you from the premises. I need to hear the OmniCorp terms," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "You are selling my algorithm. I have a right to know the valuation." Richard laughed a sharp, ugly sound. "You have no rights, Clara. You own nothing. Vanessa is the registered patent holder. If you cause a scene here today, if you breathe a single word to those executives about your ridiculous claims, I will make one phone call to the hospital. Your mother is currently on a ventilator waiting for her surgical slot. I am the medical proxy. I can authorize the cessation of care before you finish your sentence. Do you understand me?" The sheer depravity of his threat settled over me. He was perfectly willing to leverage his own wife's life to protect his payout. He thought the threat would break me. He thought it would reduce me to tears. "I understand, Richard." I said, my expression completely devoid of emotion. "Good. Now you are going to make yourself useful," he ordered, gesturing to the service station. "You want to be present for the meeting. You will serve the coffee, put on an apron, and keep your mouth shut. If you speak to the executives, I will pull the plug." He turned and walked back to the table, resuming his jovial performance. The club manager, who had witnessed the exchange, hurriedly handed me a black service apron and a silver tray loaded with fresh coffee carafes. I tied the apron over my white shirt. I picked up the heavy tray. The silver edge pressed against my bandages, but I did not flinch. I walked toward the table, adopting the invisible posture of a server. As I approached, Vanessa noticed me. Her eyes widened slightly in surprise, then quickly narrowed into a malicious gleam. She nudged Richard, drawing his attention to my compliance. Richard offered a subtle, satisfied nod. He believed he had successfully humiliated me and secured his leverage. I stopped at the edge of the table, waiting for a pause in the conversation to serve the beverages. And as you can see, gentleman, Vanessa was saying, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness, the thermal distribution metrics I designed will revolutionize your supply chain efficiency. It took me years of grueling research to perfect the code. The OmniCorp CEO, a man with sharp features and a calculating gaze, nodded approvingly. It is impressive work, Miss Kensington. Truly groundbreaking. I stepped forward to pour coffee into the empty cup sitting in front of Vanessa. I kept my movements precise and professional. Vanessa looked up at me. A cruel smirk played on her lips. She wanted to assert her dominance in front of the buyers. She wanted to punish me for daring to show up. As I tilted the heavy silver carafe, Vanessa deliberately shifted in her chair. She swung her arm outward, striking my wrist hard. The heavy carafe slipped from my grip. Boiling hot coffee sloshed over the rim, splashing directly onto the front of my crisp white shirt and scalding the skin on my chest and stomach. I gasped, instinctively stepping back, but I did not drop the tray. The searing heat burned through the fabric, but I forced my muscles to lock, refusing to give her the satisfaction of a scream. "Oh my goodness!" Vanessa exclaimed, feigning shock, though her eyes danced with vicious amusement. "You are so clumsy, Clara. Serving drinks is clearly the only career you are suited for. You really should stick to what you know. You are so uneducated." The OmniCorp executives fell silent. The CEO frowned, clearly uncomfortable with the blatant cruelty displayed by his prospective business partner. He looked from Vanessa to my stained shirt, a flicker of distaste crossing his features. But he said nothing. A $50 million deal was on the table. Ethics were a secondary concern to profit margins. Richard cleared his throat, attempting to smooth over the awkward tension. "Apologies, gentlemen. Good help is hard to find these days. Clara, clean yourself up and fetch fresh coffee." I stood perfectly still. The hot coffee soaked into my shirt, pressing against my skin. I did not reach for a napkin. I did not look at Vanessa or my father. I slowly raised my head and directed my gaze across the table, locking eyes with the man sitting directly opposite me. I was the chief legal officer for OmniCorp, a man in his late 40s wearing a conservative gray suit. He had been quietly reviewing the contract documents, entirely focused on the paperwork, until the coffee spilled. When he looked up and saw my face, the color drained completely from his cheeks. He stared at me, his eyes wide with sudden, unadulterated terror. He stopped breathing. A bead of sweat formed on his temple, tracking slowly down the side of his face. His hands gripped the edge of the table so tightly, his knuckles turned white. I knew this man. His name was Arthur Vance. 3 years ago, he was a senior compliance attorney at a mid-sized tech firm where I served as a silent technical consultant. I caught him embezzling operational funds by inflating vendor invoices. I gathered the digital evidence, presented it to the board, and personally orchestrated his immediate termination. I possessed the unredacted files that could have sent him to federal prison. I allowed him to resign quietly in exchange for his complete cooperation in returning the stolen funds. Arthur knew exactly who I was. He knew the depth of my technical expertise. And most importantly, he knew I possessed the ruthless capacity to destroy a career without a second thought. Arthur stared at the stained white shirt, recognizing the woman Vanessa had just dismissed as uneducated help. He looked at the patent documents resting on the table, bearing Vanessa's name as the sole inventor. The horrifying reality of the situation crashed down upon him. He realized that OmniCorp was preparing to purchase a stolen algorithm. He realized the brilliant inventor they were relying on to salvage the acquisition was a fraud. And he realized the true architect of the technology, the woman who held the power to detonate the entire $50 million deal and expose his own past indiscretions, was standing right in front of him, masquerading as a waitress. I did not break eye contact. I offered Arthur a slow, almost imperceptible smile, the kind of smile a predator gives its prey just before the jaws snap shut. Arthur swallowed hard, visibly trembling under the weight of my gaze. He slowly lowered the contract document back onto the table, his hands shaking. He looked at Richard and Vanessa, his expression morphing from professional courtesy to sheer, terrified panic. He understood the lethal game being played. He understood that the Kensington family was walking blindly into a slaughterhouse. And he knew that if he spoke a word of warning, if he tried to save the deal, he would be the first casualty in the crossfire. I turned my back on the table, leaving the hot coffee soaking my shirt. I did not need to pour another cup. I had successfully planted the virus deep within the OmniCorp acquisition team. The negotiations would proceed, but the foundation was already rotting from the inside out. I walked back toward the clubhouse, the heat of the burn a sharp reminder of the debt Richard owed me. A debt I was going to collect in full. The air in the private executive lounge of the country club was stale-smelling of cigar smoke and expensive scotch. The heavy oak doors were locked from the inside. I stood in the center of the room, the stained white shirt still clinging to my burned skin. I had not been permitted to change. Richard wanted me uncomfortable. He wanted me vulnerable. Richard paced the length of the room, his jaw clenched tight. The OmniCorp executives had departed an hour ago, taking the preliminary contracts back to their legal team for review. Arthur Vance, the chief legal officer, had been visibly sweating as he packed his briefcase, refusing to meet my eye or Richard's eye as he hurried out the door. Richard sensed the hesitation. He knew the deal was fragile, and he knew I was the primary variable threatening its collapse. Sitting at the small conference table in the corner was Thomas Sterling, the Kensington family's retained legal counsel. Sterling was a ruthless operator who specialized in burying corporate liabilities and intimidating whistleblowers. He possessed the moral compass of a shark. He pulled a thick document from his briefcase and slapped it onto the polished wood table. "Sit down," Clara Richard commanded, pointing a rigid finger at the chair opposite Sterling. I did not move immediately. I looked at the document. The bold header across the top page was clear. Non-disclosure agreement and comprehensive release of intellectual property claims. Sign it, Richard ordered, pacing back toward me. The OmniCorp legal team requires a signed waiver from any former technical consultant associated with the algorithm development. They want absolute assurance that no rogue contractors will challenge the patent transfer after the acquisition clears on Monday. I looked at my father. "You are asking me to sign away my legal rights to the technology I invented," I stated, keeping my voice flat. "You want me to officially recognize Vanessa as the sole creator under penalty of perjury." Sterling clicked a heavy silver pen and placed it on top of the document. "We are not asking, Miss Kensington. We are requiring it to facilitate the corporate transition. The terms are non-negotiable." I crossed my arms over my chest, ignoring the stinging burn on my skin. "I will not sign a fraudulent legal waiver affirming a lie. You stole the patent, Richard. You drained the medical escrow account. You have nothing left to leverage against me." Richard stopped pacing. He turned to face me, a slow, cruel smile spreading across his face. He looked at Vanessa, who was lounging on a leather sofa near the window, checking her manicure. "Vanessa, show your sister the leverage," Richard instructed, his voice dropping to a cold, calculating register. Vanessa sighed, retrieving her phone from her designer handbag. She tapped the screen a few times and then turned the phone around, holding it up for me to see. The screen displayed a live video feed from a hospital room. The harsh fluorescent lighting illuminated a hospital bed surrounded by medical equipment. The rhythmic, mechanical beeping of a heart monitor echoed from the phone speaker, piercing the silence of the executive lounge. Laying in the bed, frail and unconscious, was my mother. A web of transparent tubes snaked across her face, connecting her to a complex ventilation system. Her chest rose and fell, with slow, labored mechanical assistance. I felt the blood drain from my face. My breath caught in my throat. "What is this?" I demanded, stepping toward Vanessa. Richard stepped between us, blocking my path. "That is the intensive care unit at Boston General," he explained, his tone conversational, as if discussing the weather. "I transferred her there 3 hours ago, while you were serving coffee to the executives. As her legal medical proxy, I have the authority to determine the facility and the level of care she receives." He leaned closer, his breath smelling of scotch. "The private surgical team you thought you had secured using your little consulting funds, they have been dismissed. The procedure scheduled for Friday morning is canceled. I informed the hospital administration that the family can no longer afford the specialized cardiac unit." The sheer magnitude of his cruelty paralyzed me. He had canceled my mother life-saving surgery to force my compliance. "If you sign that document," Clara Richard continued, pointing to the waiver on the table, "I will authorize the transfer of funds to reinstate the private surgical team. The operation proceeds tomorrow morning. If you refuse, if you walk out that door without signing, I will instruct the hospital to downgrade her care to the standard public ward. The wait list for a valve replacement in the public sector is 6 months. She will not survive the week. The choice is yours." Vanessa smiled, lowering the phone but keeping the audio feed running. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor filled the room, a constant, terrifying countdown. "You really should sign it, Clara," she taunted. "It is the responsible thing to do for family." I stood frozen, the sound of the monitor hammering against my skull. They had weaponized my mother heartbeat. They had engineered a scenario where my intellectual property was the ransom for her survival. Any normal person would break. Any normal person would weep and sign the paper, desperately trading their future to save their mother. My hands curled into tight fists. My fingernails dug so deeply into my palms that the skin broke. I felt the warm slide of blood against my fingers. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second. I remembered the conversation I had with David in the rain-soaked alleyway 12 hours ago. I remembered the cold, analytical strategy he had laid out on the hood of his SUV. "They will try to force your signature," Clara David had warned, his voice echoing in my memory. "Richard will use the medical proxy. He will threaten her care. When he does, you must comply. Do not fight the coercion. Document it." I opened my eyes. The panic that had gripped my chest evaporated, replaced by a freezing, absolute clarity. Richard thought he was executing a flawless extortion plot. He did not realize he was actively manufacturing the evidence required for his own federal indictment. I walked slowly toward the conference table. Sterling smirked, pushing the document and the silver pen closer to the edge. "You are making the right decision," Miss Kensington Sterling said, his voice smooth and oily. I did not look at the lawyer. I looked at the live video feed still playing on Vanessa's phone. I listened to the steady beep of the monitor. Then I looked directly into Richard's eyes. I offered him a cold, razor-sharp smile. I picked up the heavy silver pen. I did not hesitate. I did not read the terms of the non-disclosure agreement. I flipped directly to the final signature page. I pressed the pen against the paper and signed my full legal name with aggressive, fluid strokes. The signature was large, bold, and definitive. I tossed the pen onto the table. It clattered against the wood. "There," I said, stepping back from the table. "The patent is yours. The algorithm is yours. Now reinstate the surgical team." Richard snatched the document from the table, his eyes scanning the signature page. A look of profound, greedy triumph washed over his face. He had won. He had secured the $50 million buyout. He had crushed the rebellious daughter and legally insulated his stolen asset. He folded the document and handed it to Sterling, who quickly tucked it into his briefcase. "Excellent," Richard said, turning to Vanessa. "Call the hospital administration. Authorize the payment for the private ward. Tell them the surgery proceeds as scheduled." Vanessa rolled her eyes, tapping on her phone. "Done," she muttered, dismissing the live video feed. Richard looked back at me, his expression morphing from triumph to sheer contempt. "You served your purpose, Clara. Now get out of my sight. Do not return to the corporate offices. Do not contact the OmniCorp executives. If I see your face before the check clears on Monday, I will rescind the medical authorization immediately." He pointed toward the heavy oak doors. "Leave." I did not argue. I did not hurl insults. I turned and walked toward the exit, the burned fabric of my shirt pulling against my skin. I reached for the brass handle and pulled the heavy door open. As I stepped out into the carpeted hallway, I glanced back over my shoulder. Richard was pouring himself another glass of scotch, celebrating his masterful negotiation. Vanessa was already scrolling through luxury real estate listings on her phone, mentally spending her unearned payout. They had absolutely no idea what they had just done. Under federal law, a legally binding contract signed under direct duress or extortion is completely null and void. But more importantly, the mechanism of that extortion, holding a dying woman medical care hostage while broadcasting her condition on a live video feed, elevated the act from a civil contract dispute to a severe criminal offense. David had needed irrefutable proof of Richard's malicious intent to secure the federal warrants. He needed Richard to cross the line from corporate theft to actual physical endangerment. Richard had just documented his own guilt. By forcing my signature using the video of the intensive care unit, he had officially committed extortion in the second degree. He had handed me the exact weapon required to bypass civil litigation and move directly to criminal prosecution. I walked out of the country club into the bright morning sun. The pain in my back was a distant memory. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed David Private Secure Line. He answered on the first ring. I signed the waiver I stated, keeping my voice low as I walked toward my car. They used the medical proxy. They broadcast the ICU feed to force the signature. "Excellent," David replied, his voice thrumming with lethal satisfaction. "The federal prosecutor will love the video element. It proves premeditation and cruelty. We have the criminal leverage. Now we initiate the financial strike. Return to the operations center immediately, Clara. We have 24 hours to ensure OmniCorp chokes on the bait." I ended the call and climbed into my sedan. Richard thought he had secured a $50 million future. He did not realize I had just handed him a fully executed prison sentence. The trap was locked. It was time to pull the trigger. The ghost kitchen was not a culinary workspace. It was a subterranean data center located 3 stories beneath an abandoned warehouse in the industrial district of South Boston. This was my sanctuary, a climate-controlled fortress housing the proprietary server banks that ran the operational logistics for the entire East Coast supply chain. The low, steady hum of the cooling units was the only sound in the expansive room. I sat at the primary console, a semicircular bank of high-definition monitors displaying real-time data streams. The bandage on my back felt tight, but I ignored it. We had exactly 24 hours before the OmniCorp signing ceremony commenced in the glass atrium of their corporate headquarters. David stood behind me, shedding his suit jacket and rolling up his sleeves. The polished corporate defense attorney was gone, replaced by the ruthless financial operator who dismantled conglomerates for sport. He plugged a heavily encrypted flash drive into the secondary terminal, connecting his laptop to my secure network. "I need complete access to the OmniCorp acquisition portal." David instructed, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. I deployed a tracking beacon embedded in the digital non-disclosure agreement Richard forced you to sign. When Sterling uploaded the document to the OmniCorp legal server an hour ago, the beacon initiated a backdoor tunnel. "We are bypassing their firewall now." I typed a sequence of commands granting his laptop unrestricted bandwidth through my proxy servers. The screens flickered as David ran a brute force decryption protocol against the OmniCorp mainframe. I watched the progress bar inch forward. "Richard believes the extortion secured the deal." I said, the memory of the country club lounge still fresh. "He thinks OmniCorp is oblivious to the theft. He thinks $50 million is a guaranteed payout." David scoffed, his eyes locked on the scrolling lines of code. "Richard is an amateur playing in a professional league. He assumes he is the smartest predator in the room. He drastically underestimates the apex predators sitting across the table." The progress bar hit 100%. A massive cache of internal OmniCorp emails and executive memorandums flooded the secondary monitors. David's eyes darted across the text, rapidly filtering the corporate jargon for actionable intelligence. He stopped typing. The rhythmic hum of the servers seemed to grow louder in the sudden silence. David leaned closer to the screen, reading a specific email thread exchanged between the OmniCorp CEO and their chief legal officer, Arthur Vance. David let out a low, humorless chuckle. He reached forward and tapped the screen, highlighting a heavily redacted paragraph. "They know," David stated, his voice dropping to a harsh, cynical register. "OmniCorp knows the algorithm is stolen. Arthur Vance recognized you at the country club. He immediately briefed the CEO on your identity and your capacity to detonate the patent transfer." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. OmniCorp is aware. Richard is selling a fraudulent asset. I asked, the layers of corruption compounding. Then why are they proceeding with the $50 million acquisition? Why risk the federal exposure? "Because they are not paying $50 million, David replied, tapping a few more keys to open a draft of the final acquisition contract. He printed the document and tossed the thick stack of paper onto the console in front of me. "Read the penalty clauses." I picked up the contract. My eyes scanned the dense legal text, bypassing the celebratory boilerplate language and focusing directly on the breach of warranty stipulations. The structure was brilliant and entirely predatory. OmniCorp was acquiring Kensington Hospitality for a staggering sum, but they had quietly inserted a draconian indemnification clause buried deep within the intellectual property transfer section. The clause stated that if the proprietary algorithm was subsequently proven to be encumbered by undisclosed third-party claims, the purchase price would be retroactively adjusted to a punitive valuation of $1. Furthermore, Kensington Hospitality would be held liable for an additional $50 million in punitive damages. "They are setting a trap," I whispered, the sheer scale of the deception settling over me. "They know Richard stole the technology from me. They expect me to sue him for patent infringement after the sale closes." "Exactly," David confirmed, stepping back from the terminal. "OmniCorp is allowing Richard to walk onto that stage tomorrow morning, believing he has won the lottery. They will sign the paperwork, absorbing the algorithm into their corporate structure. The moment you file your lawsuit asserting your rightful ownership, OmniCorp triggers the penalty clause. They use your lawsuit as the legal justification to void the payout." David leaned against the server rack, crossing his arms. "It is a classic corporate cannibalization strategy. The big fish swallows the little fish. OmniCorp acquires the algorithm, they acquire the Kensington Hotel portfolio, and Richard is left holding a $50 million liability judgment. They take everything, and Richard is utterly bankrupted." The reality of the situation was staggering. My own father had betrayed me to save his empire, and the empire he was selling it to was planning to annihilate him using the very betrayal he engineered. It was a perfect closed loop of corporate malice. "If OmniCorp swallows this contract tomorrow morning," David continued, his tone urgent, "your life work becomes the permanent property of a multinational conglomerate. They have an army of litigators. They will tie you up in intellectual property court for a decade, burying you in legal fees until you are forced to settle for pennies. You will lose the algorithm, Clara. We have to stop the signing." I looked away from the contract and stared at the banks of blinking servers. These machines housed the core architecture of the thermal distribution algorithm. I had spent 3 years writing the code, optimizing the logistical pathways, ensuring the preservation systems operated with absolute zero failure rates. It was not just software, it was my creation. The anger I had felt in the alleyway, the physical pain of the burn, the betrayal of the forced signature, all of it crystallized into a terrifying absolute clarity. Richard wanted to sell my genius to save his ego. OmniCorp wanted to exploit my genius to crush a competitor. They both viewed me as a passive asset, a pawn to be moved across their respective chessboards. They believed the transaction was inevitable. I turned back to the primary console. My hands hovered over the keyboard. "I am not stopping the signing." "David," I said, my voice cold and devoid of any hesitation, "I am going to let them walk onto that stage tomorrow. I am going to let the cameras flash. I am going to let Richard pick up the pen." David frowned, stepping closer. "Clara, if they sign that document, the transfer initiates automatically. You will lose control of the source code. I will not lose control." I replied, my fingers beginning to fly across the keys with lethal precision. "Because the source code they are purchasing will no longer exist. I bypass the standard user interface and access the deep root directory of the algorithm. This was the foundational architecture, the raw mathematics that governed the entire preservation system. I did not attempt to delete the files. Deletion leaves traces. Deletion can be recovered by a competent forensic team. I opened the core operational logic sequence. OmniCorp thinks they are buying a functional revolutionary system. I explained, my eyes tracking the endless streams of green code cascading down the monitor. They think they are outsmarting Richard. Richard thinks he is outsmarting me. They are both operating under the assumption that the machine they are fighting over actually works. I initiated a complex rewrite protocol. I did not destroy the code. I poisoned it. I introduced a cascading logic bomb buried deep within the thermal distribution parameters. It was a sophisticated algorithmic failsafe, designed to look like a catastrophic system error that only triggered when the proprietary transfer key was activated. "Tomorrow morning," I said, executing the final command string, "when OmniCorp attempts to integrate the algorithm into their mainframe, the system will initiate a hard lockdown. The preservation metrics will corrupt. The logistical pathways will freeze. The entire software package will brick itself permanently." I hit the enter key. The servers hummed loudly for a fraction of a second as the poisoned code overwrote the foundational architecture. The trap was armed. "Tomorrow," I stated, leaning back in my chair and looking up at David, "neither of them gets to swallow the other. I am going to make them both choke on the transaction right there on the stage in front of the financial press." David stared at the monitor, watching the confirmation sequence complete. A slow, predatory smile spread across his face. He recognized the sheer, unadulterated devastation of the maneuver. I had not just broken the machine, I had weaponized it. The financial trap is set. David confirmed, pulling his jacket back on. I will finalize the Apex Holdings foreclosure documents tonight. When the OmniCorp deal implodes on stage, Richard will have zero liquidity. He will be entirely exposed to the $20 million debt collection. I stood up, the burn on my back aching, but the pain was negligible compared to the impending execution. Get some sleep, David, I said, turning off the primary monitors. Tomorrow morning we walk into the lion den and we burn the entire jungle to the ground. The morning sun reflected harshly off the steel and glass facade of the OmniCorp tower. The building dominated the financial district, an architectural monument to corporate consumption. Today, it was the designated site for the $50 million acquisition of Kensington Hospitality. I stepped out of the passenger side of David Black SUV. I did not wear a stained shirt or an apologetic expression. I wore a tailored, razor-sharp charcoal suit. It was the armor of a chief executive preparing to execute a hostile takeover. David emerged from the driver's side, adjusting his cuffs, his heavy leather briefcase gripped firmly in his hand. We walked toward the main plaza, our steps synchronized and deliberate. The plaza was a hive of activity. Vans from the major financial news networks idled near the curb, technicians running thick black cables toward the entrance. Reporters stood in clusters checking their notes, preparing to broadcast the merger that would reshape the regional hospitality industry. It was a spectacle designed to project an aura of inevitable triumph. We reached the base of the wide marble steps leading to the main entrance. Blocking the heavy glass doors was a phalanx of private security contractors. These were not OmniCorp personnel. They wore the distinct silver lapel pins of the firm Richard had hired, the same firm that had dragged me out of his office and dumped me into the rain 48 hours prior. The lead guard, a man with a thick neck and a radio earpiece, recognized me immediately. He stepped forward, positioning his broad frame directly in my path. He raised a hand, a universal gesture of denial. "You need to turn around." "Miss Kensington," the guard commanded, his voice low, but carrying a clear physical threat. Mr. Kensington provided explicit instructions. "You are not on the approved guest list. You do not have press credentials. Access is denied." I did not break stride. I did not look at the guard. I kept my eyes fixed on the glass doors leading into the grand atrium. David moved smoothly to my right, intercepting the guard line of sight. "Stand down." David ordered, his tone radiating absolute legal authority. "We have business inside." The guard scoffed, his hand drifting toward the tactical baton holstered on his belt. "I do not care who you are, counselor. My orders are absolute." She takes one more step, and she leaves in handcuffs. Before the guard could unclip the baton, the heavy glass doors swung open from the inside. The immediate scent of roasted espresso and expensive catering spilled out onto the steps. Standing in the threshold, holding a clipboard and wearing an immaculate white chef coat, was Julian Rossi. The Michelin-starred executive chef who had derailed Richard's cake-cutting ceremony had been contracted by OmniCorp to cater the VIP signing breakfast. Julian assessed the confrontation on the steps. His dark eyes flicked from the aggressive security guard to me. He did not hesitate. He stepped past the security line, effectively breaking their perimeter. "Is there a problem here?" Julian demanded, his voice carrying the booming resonance of a kitchen commander used to absolute obedience. The lead guard frowned, clearly confused by the interference of a high-profile contractor. "Mr. Rossi, this woman is a restricted individual. She is attempting to breach a secure corporate event." Julian let out a sharp, dismissive laugh. "A restricted individual." He turned to face the security team, his expression a mask of pure aristocratic disdain. "You are attempting to block the primary architect of the very technology your employer is currently selling. She is not a restricted individual. She is my personal guest of honor." Julian stepped aside, extending his arm toward the open doorway, creating a clear, unobstructed path into the building. "If anyone attempts to remove her," Julian announced loudly enough for the nearby reporters to hear, "I will personally pack up my kitchen and walk out of this building, taking my entire catering staff with me." Let us see how OmniCorp enjoys signing a $50 million merger over stale tap water. The threat was highly effective. The security guards hesitated, glancing at one another, unsure how to handle a high-profile vendor actively sabotaging their orders. The confusion bought us exactly the window we needed. I offered Julian a slight nod of acknowledgement. "Thank you, Julian." He offered a curt, professional bow. "Give them hell, Clara." David and I walked through the open doors, bypassing the paralyzed security detail and stepping into the expansive glass atrium of the OmniCorp tower. The scale of the event was staggering. The atrium was packed with industry insiders, financial analysts, and corporate lawyers. A raised stage dominated the far end of the room, framed by massive digital screens displaying the logos of both OmniCorp and Kensington Hospitality. The atmosphere hummed with the superficial excitement of a major financial transaction. I did not stop to mingle. I walked directly down the center aisle, my heels striking the polished granite floor in a steady, relentless rhythm. The crowd parted instinctively, sensing the sudden shift in atmospheric pressure. On the stage, the ceremony was reaching its climax. Richard Kensington stood at a heavy mahogany signing table, holding a gold-plated fountain pen. He beamed for the flashing cameras of the press corps, projecting the image of a visionary leader, securing a historic partnership. Beside him stood the OmniCorp CEO, wearing a predatory smile, anticipating the successful theft of a revolutionary asset. Hovering near Richard's shoulder was Vanessa. She wore a vibrant crimson evening gown, entirely inappropriate for a morning business signing, but perfectly calibrated to draw the attention of the cameras. She smiled and waved, acting the part of the brilliant young inventor, the savior of the Kensington legacy. I reached the midpoint of the center aisle, exactly 30 feet from the stage. Vanessa saw me first. The radiant, performative smile froze on her face. Her eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated panic. She gripped the edge of the signing table, her knuckles turning white. The illusion of her triumph shattered instantly, replaced by the terrifying realization that the ghost she thought she had banished had returned to haunt the execution. Richard followed her gaze. He looked up from the contract documents, his gold pen hovering inches above the signature line. He saw me standing in the center aisle, flanked by David. He saw the charcoal suit. He saw the cold, impenetrable certainty in my posture. The color drained from Richard's face. The triumphant glow vanished, replaced by a sickly ashen hue. His hand trembled, causing the tip of the gold pen to tap erratically against the heavy parchment paper. He opened his mouth, but no sound emerged. The visionary leader was suddenly reduced to a terrified, desperate man staring down the barrel of his own destruction. The sudden silence emanating from the stage rippled through the atrium. The reporters, sensing the abrupt deviation from the script, lowered their cameras, turning their attention from the executives on the platform to the woman standing in the aisle. The air in the room thickened, turning heavy and suffocating. The carefully orchestrated ceremony halted completely. 200 pairs of eyes shifted between me and my father, waiting for the impending detonation. The quiet before the storm stretched for 3 agonizing seconds. Then I took the final steps toward the stage, preparing to pull the pin. The silence in the atrium was absolute. The tension was a physical weight pressing against the chests of every reporter, executive, and investor in the room. The OmniCorp CEO, a man named Harrison Vance, who built his career on exploiting weakness, sensed the sudden catastrophic shift in leverage. He did not know my name, but he recognized the sheer primal terror radiating from Richard and Vanessa. He understood that the woman standing in the center aisle represented an uncalculated variable that threatened his acquisition. Vance was a predator, and predators do not like variables. They like control. He lowered his own gold signing pen onto the mahogany table. He turned away from the acquisition documents and looked directly at Vanessa. A slow, calculating smile spread across his face. It was not a smile of partnership. It was a test. A public interrogation designed to verify the asset before committing $50 million. Before we finalized this historic agreement, Vance announced, his voice amplified by the podium microphone, echoing through the expansive glass hall. "I think the press would appreciate a few words from the brilliant mind behind this acquisition." He gestured gracefully toward Vanessa. The cameras immediately swiveled, locking onto her crimson dress. Miss Kensington Vance purred, his tone dripping with artificial admiration. "As the sole inventor of this revolutionary nitrogen preservation system, perhaps you could indulge us. Could you provide a brief, high-level explanation of the thermodynamic distribution metrics governing the algorithmic supply chain parameters?" It was a trap disguised as a compliment. For anyone who had actually written the code, it was a rudimentary question. It was the equivalent of asking an architect to describe a foundational support beam. But for a woman whose technical expertise ended at selecting an Instagram filter, it was a verbal execution block. Vanessa froze. The panicked flush that had crept into her cheeks suddenly vanished, leaving her skin a sallow, sickly white. She stared at Vance, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly, like a fish pulled onto dry land. The reporters leaned forward, sensing blood in the water. The camera flashes intensified, capturing the exact moment the alleged genius inventor suffered a catastrophic system failure on a public stage. Vanessa's eyes darted wildly, searching the room for an escape route. She looked at the teleprompter, hoping a script might magically appear. She looked at the floor. Finally, in a desperate, pathetic display of incompetence, she looked at Richard, silently begging her father to rescue her from her own fraud. Richard stepped forward, attempting to physically shield his daughter from the scrutiny of the press corps. The polished executive veneer was cracking, revealing the desperate, sweating fraudster underneath. Now Harrison Richard interjected, his voice tight and overly loud, attempting to project confidence. We both know that level of specific technical data constitutes a highly sensitive trade secret. We cannot discuss proprietary thermodynamic metrics in front of the press. The intellectual property agreements strictly prohibit it. He reached for the microphone, attempting to physically wrest control of the narrative back from Vance. Let us focus on the strategic partnership, gentlemen, and finalize the paperwork. No, Richard, a clear, powerful voice resonated from the center aisle. I did not have a microphone. I did not need one. The absolute stillness of the room amplified my words, ensuring they carried to the very back of the atrium. It is not a trade secret, I stated, holding Richard's gaze with unwavering intensity. It is basic physics. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, closing the distance between the aisle and the base of the stage. The crowd parted further, clearing a path for the true architect to approach the podium. The thermodynamic distribution metrics are governed by a dynamic feedback loop. I explained, my voice devoid of hesitation, projecting the absolute certainty of creation. The algorithm monitors the ambient nitrogen saturation levels across the entire logistical chain in real time. It utilizes a predictive thermal degradation model, adjusting the cryogenic output ratios based on microclimate variations within the transport containers. I took another step, ensuring the technical reporters in the front row caught every syllable. If the ambient temperature spikes by a margin of 0.05 degrees Celsius, the algorithm triggers an isolated nitrogen purge, stabilizing the core temperature without compromising the structural integrity of the surrounding perishable assets. It is a closed-loop system, Richard. It requires a baseline understanding of fluid dynamics, not a public relations spin. The press corps erupted. The financial journalists who had been taking notes on a boring corporate merger suddenly realized they were witnessing a live corporate espionage scandal. Dozens of cameras physically turned away from the stage and pointed directly at me. The flashes blinded my peripheral vision, but I kept my eyes locked on the men at the signing table. Harrison Vance narrowed his eyes. The calculating smirk vanished, replaced by a sharp, aggressive focus. He looked from Vanessa, who was currently hyperventilating in her crimson dress, to me standing in a tailored suit, explaining complex physics off the cuff. The CEO of OmniCorp was many things, but he was not an idiot. He realized instantly that the woman OmniCorp was relying on to salvage the acquisition was a complete fraud. He realized that the actual creator, the true owner of the $50 million asset, was standing below the stage, actively dismantling the transaction. Richard lost whatever remained of his composure. The realization that his theft was being exposed on live television shattered his control. He abandoned the microphone and lunged toward the edge of the stage. Security! Richard roared, his face contorted in a mask of apoplectic rage. He pointed a shaking finger at me, spit flying from his lips. "Get her out of here. Arrest that woman. She is insane. She is trying to sabotage a federal contract. Security, remove her immediately." 3 large security guards, the same men who had previously been paralyzed by Julian Rossi, broke from their positions near the exit and rushed down the center aisle toward me. They reached for their tactical batons, preparing to physically drag me out of the atrium, just as they had dragged me out of Richard's office. They thought physical force could silence the truth. They did not understand that the truth was no longer just a verbal argument. It was a verified digital reality, and I was about to drop the final execution order right onto their signing table. The heavy boots of the private security team pounded against the granite floor. The lead guard reached out his thick hand, extending toward my shoulder, preparing to forcefully remove me from the atrium. He never made contact. David stepped smoothly into his path, blocking the aggressive maneuver with his own broad frame. He did not raise his fists. He reached into his breast pocket and produced a sleek black leather wallet. He flipped it open, revealing a heavy gold shield resting next to a federal identification card. Federal Defense Counsel David stated his voice a low, rumbling threat that demanded absolute obedience. "Stand down immediately, or I will have you and your entire firm indicted for federal assault and obstruction. Touch her, and you will spend the next 5 years defending yourselves against a battery of civil rights lawsuits." The security guards froze, staring at the badge. The lead guard slowly lowered his hand, realizing that dragging a woman out of a corporate event was one thing, but assaulting a federal attorney in front of 50 television cameras was a career-ending catastrophic mistake. They stepped back, forming a cautious perimeter, but refusing to execute Richard's illegal order. I did not stop walking. I bypassed the neutralized security detail and climbed the 3 short steps onto the main stage. Vanessa scrambled backward, nearly tripping over the hem of her expensive gown, desperately trying to put distance between us. Richard stood paralyzed near the podium, his hands gripping the wood so tightly his knuckles were bone white. I ignored them both. I walked directly to the heavy mahogany signing table and locked eyes with Harrison Vance. The OmniCorp CEO stared back at me, his calculating gaze evaluating the threat I posed to his acquisition. "The contract you are preparing to sign is a fraudulent document," I announced, projecting my voice so every reporter in the front row captured the statement. "You are attempting to purchase stolen intellectual property from a man who lacks the legal authority to sell it." Vance narrowed his eyes. "Those are severe accusations, Miss Kensington. We have verified the patent registrations. The documents clearly list Vanessa Kensington as the sole inventor." I reached into the pocket of my blazer and pulled out a small encrypted silver USB drive. I tossed it onto the mahogany table. It landed with a sharp metallic clink, resting directly on top of the $50 million acquisition agreement. "Paperwork can be forged, Mr. Vance," I replied, keeping my tone cold and clinical. "Signatures can be coerced, but source code does not lie. The registration documents your legal team reviewed are worthless. I am the foundational architect of the thermal distribution algorithm. I hold the master cryptographic keys to the root directory." Vance glanced down at the USB drive, then back up at me, a flicker of genuine apprehension crossing his features. "Last night I continued ensuring my words carried the weight of absolute destruction. I activated a proprietary override protocol embedded deep within the core architecture. The entire logistical network your company is preparing to purchase, the automated cooling systems, the predictive routing software, the warehouse preservation modules, is currently in a state of terminal lockdown." I leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the table. "If you sign that contract today, Mr. Vance, you are not buying a revolutionary technology. You are buying $50 million worth of bricked servers and useless code. The system is dead. You are buying an empty shell." Vance did not wait for his legal team to advise him. He ripped open his laptop sitting near the edge of the table and rapidly keyed in his administrative credentials. He accessed the OmniCorp integration testing portal, the secure network designed to monitor the Kensington algorithms they were preparing to absorb. The press corps fell completely silent. The only sound in the atrium was the frantic clicking of Vance's keyboard. He stared at the screen. The polished executive facade cracked violently. The entire dashboard, which should have displayed a complex web of active logistical data streams, was glowing a harsh, angry red. A massive error notification pulsed in the center of the screen, warning of catastrophic system failure and unauthorized encryption overrides. Every single operational metric was frozen. The system was entirely dead. Vance slammed the laptop shut with a deafening crack that echoed through the hall. He turned toward Richard, his face contorted in a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. The veins in his neck bulged against his expensive silk collar. "You lied to me," Vance roared, spittle flying from his lips. You brought me a stolen, compromised asset. You tried to sell OmniCorp a fraudulent patent holding a dead system." Richard stumbled backward, holding his hands up defensively. "Harrison, please let me explain. It is a minor technical glitch. We can fix the code. We can patch the system before the end of the day." "You do not own the code," Vance bellowed, grabbing the thick stack of acquisition documents from the table. "You own nothing but a failing hotel chain and a mountain of debt." With a vicious, violent motion, Vance ripped the $50 million contract in half. He threw the torn pages into the air, raining the shredded remains of Richard Financial Salvation down onto the stage. "The deal is dead," Vance announced, glaring at Richard with absolute contempt. "My legal team will be filing a massive civil suit against Kensington Hospitality for breach of contract and fraudulent misrepresentation before noon. You are finished, Richard. OmniCorp will bury you." Vanessa screamed a high-pitched, hysterical sound. She lunged forward, trying to grab the torn pieces of the contract fluttering to the floor. No, you cannot cancel the deal," she sobbed desperately, trying to piece the paper back together. "We need the money. We need the buyout." She reached out to grab Vance's arm, attempting to plead with the furious CEO. Vance batted her hand away with a violent, dismissive swipe. The force of the rejection sent Vanessa stumbling backward, her high heels catching on the carpet. She fell hard onto the stage, her red dress tangling around her legs, a pathetic weeping mess, clutching shredded paper. Richard did not try to help his daughter up. He fell to his knees, grasping the edge of the mahogany table for support. His chest heaved as he stared at the torn contract. The color drained entirely from his face, leaving him looking hollow and ancient. The $50 million lifeline he needed to pay off his shadow debt to save his estate, to save his ego, was gone. He had sacrificed his wife and betrayed his daughter to secure that contract, and now it lay in ruins at his feet. The financial press captured every second of his absolute public humiliation. The flashing cameras recorded the precise moment the Kensington Empire collapsed on live television. The crowd of investors and executives murmured in shocked satisfaction, witnessing the brutal, efficient execution of corporate karma. But I was not finished. Richard had lost his future, but he had not yet faced the consequences of his past. The destruction of the OmniCorp deal was only the preliminary strike. The true killing blow, the absolute transfer of power, was still waiting in the wings. I looked down at the ruined man kneeling before me, preparing to deliver the final verdict. Richard remained on his knees, grasping the edge of the signing table as if it were a life raft. The torn pieces of the OmniCorp contract were scattered across the stage, a visual representation of his ruined future. He slowly lifted his head and looked at me. The arrogant, commanding patriarch was gone. In his place was a desperate, terrified man watching his empire burn. "You just killed this family." Richard rasped, his voice cracking under the strain of absolute panic. "You destroyed everything I built." He struggled to his feet, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You do not understand what you have done, Clara. The people I borrowed from to keep this company afloat, they are not bankers. They are monsters. If I do not have that $50 million payout to cover the margins, they will take the hotels. They will take the house. They will leave us with nothing. Fix the code. Restore the algorithm right now, and I will give you whatever percentage you want." I stood perfectly still, crossing my arms over my chest. I did not flinch at his desperation. I looked at him with an expression of pure, freezing indifference. "You are referring to the $20 million loan secured through the Shadow Equity Group," I asked, my voice projecting clearly over the murmurs of the stunned press corps. "The loan you collateralized using every asset this family possessed, including the medical escrow account, meant to save my mother's life." Richard swallowed hard, sweat beading on his forehead. "Yes," he whispered, the admission forced out of him by sheer terror. "They are aggressive. Their terms are brutal. We need the OmniCorp money, Clara, or we are dead. I did not offer him a lifeline. I offered him an execution." I uncrossed my arms and gave a sharp, definitive snap of my fingers. David, who had remained near the base of the stage, waiting for his cue, ascended the steps with methodical grace. He did not rush. He walked with the imposing, deliberate posture of a legal predator moving in for the kill. He carried a heavy leather portfolio embossed with the seal of his corporate defense firm. David stopped beside me, creating an impenetrable wall of legal authority. He unclasped the portfolio and withdrew a thick stack of documents stamped heavily with red ink. "Mr. Kensington," David announced, his deep, resonant voice echoing through the glass atrium, commanding the attention of every reporter and executive in the room. "I stand before you today, acting as the primary legal counsel and authorized representative for Apex Holdings, LLC." David held the documents up, ensuring the flashing cameras captured the official seals. "I am formally serving you with a notice of default and immediate seizure." David continued reading the legal declaration with lethal precision. "The $20 million commercial note you secured through your shadow lenders contained a strict performance clause. Full principal repayment was due by 9 o'clock this morning. It is currently 9:15. You have officially defaulted on your obligations." Richard let out a harsh, jagged laugh bordering on hysteria. He pointed a dismissive, trembling finger at David. "Apex Holdings," he mocked, his voice shrill. "Who the hell is Apex Holdings? Some bottom-feeding collection agency trying to squeeze a few pennies out of a delayed transaction. I do not care who you represent, counselor. My original lenders will deal with you. They will crush your little firm." David did not react to the insult. He simply lowered the documents and looked at me, yielding the floor for the final devastating blow. The payoff had arrived. The trap built in the rain-soaked alleyway 48 hours ago was ready to snap shut. I took a slow, measured step forward, closing the physical distance until I was standing mere inches from my father. I looked directly into his panicked, bloodshot eyes. "Apex Holdings is not a collection agency, Richard." I stated, my voice dropping to a smooth, lethal register that carried absolute finality. I watched his face, waiting for the realization to dawn. "Apex Holdings is a private shell corporation." I continued, delivering the final, crushing verdict. "I established it 3 years ago to manage the consulting royalties I earned while you were busy ignoring my potential." Richard stopped breathing. The manic energy fueling his defiance evaporated instantly. When your shadow lenders realized you were desperate enough to steal your own daughter's intellectual property to secure a sale, they classified your debt as a toxic liability, I explained, spelling out the exact nature of his ruin. They wanted your $20 million note off their books before you dragged them into a federal fraud investigation. They sold the debt on the secondary market at a massive discount. I leaned closer, dropping my voice so only he and the nearest reporters could hear the final sentence. "I authorized the purchase through Apex Holdings yesterday morning. I bought your debt, Richard. I am your primary creditor. You do not owe a shadow equity group $20 million anymore. You owe me." The atrium erupted. The financial press, recognizing the sheer unprecedented scale of the corporate ambush, shouted questions over one another. The cameras surged forward, capturing the absolute devastation on Richard's face. He stared at me, his eyes wide with profound, uncomprehending horror. He was struggling to connect the anonymous corporate entity that held his life in its hands to the daughter he had physically shoved away from a birthday cake just days prior. You cannot do this." Richard stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "You do not have that kind of capital." I smiled, a cold, predatory smile that did not reach my eyes. "You underestimated my resources because you evaluated my worth based on your own arrogance," I replied. "You thought I was a weak asset to be exploited. You forgot I am the architect who built the infrastructure of your entire company." I turned slightly, addressing the room at large, but keeping my focus on the ruined man before me. "Because you are currently in severe default on the terms of this mortgage, Apex Holdings exercises its immediate right to initiate total foreclosure proceedings," I announced, executing the final administrative protocol. I reached into David's portfolio and pulled out a single crisp white sheet of paper. I dropped it directly onto the mahogany table right over the shredded pieces of the OmniCorp contract. "This is a formal notice of asset seizure," I declared, my voice ringing clear and authoritative. "As the primary creditor holding a defaulted note, I am officially seizing all collateral associated with Kensington Hospitality. I am taking the commercial properties. I am taking the operational accounts. And I am taking the family estate." Richard Sterling, the man who had built his identity on the illusion of absolute control, simply folded. His legs gave way beneath him. He collapsed onto the stage, the rigid, aristocratic posture dissolving entirely. He looked small, ancient, and utterly defeated. The arrogance that had defined his existence was stripped away, leaving nothing but a bankrupt man staring at the floor. Vanessa, still sobbing nearby, looked at the eviction notice and the foreclosure documents. The finality of the situation settled over her as well. There was no escape. There was no leverage. The empire they had both worshipped and manipulated was burning to the ground, and I had personally handed them the match. The execution was flawless, but the purge was not yet complete. The financial ruin was absolute, but the legal consequences of their actions were still waiting to be served. I stepped back from the table, preparing to watch the final layer of their destruction unfold. The air in the glass atrium felt as though it had been violently compressed. The silence following my declaration was absolute, a vacuum created by the sudden catastrophic inversion of power. Richard remained on his knees, his chest heaving, his eyes locked on me with an expression of profound, irreversible shock. The man who had dismissed me as uneducated and worthless was currently kneeling before the sole owner of his entire existence. When the foundation of a corrupt alliance cracks, it does not crumble slowly, it shatters, and the resulting shrapnel always targets the closest available victims. The realization that the $50 million buyout was dead, that the hotels were seized, and that their social standing was annihilated finally breached Vanessa's wall of denial. She looked at the shredded OmniCorp contract, then at the foreclosure notice, and finally at her father. The elegant, poised heiress vanished completely. In her place was a frantic feral creature, realizing she was trapped in a burning building. Vanessa let out a sharp, guttural scream. She lunged across the stage, abandoning any pretense of aristocratic decorum. She threw herself at Richard, her perfectly manicured hands curling into claws. "This is your fault," Vanessa shrieked, raking her nails across the lapels of his custom suit. "You did this to us. You told me it was a foolproof plan. You forced me to put my name on that stolen patent application." She beat her fists against his shoulders, her voice shrill and echoing through the expansive hall. "You dragged me into your pathetic gambling debts. You made me look like a fool in front of Harrison Vance. You ruined my reputation. I am a laughingstock because you could not manage a simple business transaction without resorting to theft." Richard, stunned by the physical assault and the venomous accusation, recoiled. The shock on his face rapidly hardened into a mask of pure defensive rage. He shoved Vanessa backward with brutal force. "Do not blame me, you ungrateful parasite," Richard roared, his voice cracking with fury. "I built this empire so you could spend your days planning country club luncheons and buying designer bags. You have never worked a day in your life. You have never contributed a single original thought to this family." Vanessa stumbled, catching her balance against the mahogany table. Her crimson dress tore at the seam, but she did not notice. She glared at her father, her chest heaving. "You are a bankrupt fraud," she spat. "You stole from your own wife's surgical fund because you are a failure." Richard lunged forward, his face a dangerous mottled red. He raised his hand and struck Vanessa across the face. The sharp crack of the slap echoed over the murmurs of the stunned press corps. Vanessa fell hard onto the stage, clutching her cheek, her eyes wide with shock. "If you had half the intelligence of your sister," Richard bellowed, pointing a trembling finger at the woman cowering on the floor, "I would not be facing foreclosure. If you possessed a fraction of her capability, we would have secured a legitimate acquisition years ago. You are a useless ornament, Vanessa. You are nothing but an expensive liability." The two of them descended into an ugly, vicious brawl right there on the raised platform. They screamed obscenities, hurling years of repressed resentment and buried failures at one another. They fought over the scraps of a destroyed legacy, desperately trying to assign blame for a catastrophe they had jointly engineered. The polished, sophisticated veneer of the Kensington family was entirely gone, replaced by a pathetic display of desperate animals turning on their own kind to survive. I took a slow, deliberate step back from the edge of the conflict. I crossed my arms over my chest and watched the spectacle unfold. I did not raise my voice. I did not intervene to separate them. I did not expend a single ounce of energy. David stood beside me, his posture relaxed, his dark eyes tracking the implosion with clinical satisfaction. "It is a fundamental rule of fraud," David observed, his voice low and steady. "When the capital evaporates, the loyalty evaporates with it. They are cannibalizing each other to secure a better narrative for the bankruptcy hearings." The financial journalists who had arrived expecting to cover a boring corporate merger were now frantically documenting a live, high-definition family meltdown. Camera flashes strobed relentlessly, capturing Richard, red-faced and screaming, and Vanessa weeping on the floor. Every vicious insult, every admission of theft and incompetence was recorded and broadcast directly to the public. They were doing the work of the prosecution, right there on the stage. They were publicly admitting to the theft of the intellectual property. They were confessing to the desperate financial maneuvering that necessitated the fraud. They were providing undeniable recorded testimony of their own guilt. I watched them tear their own empire apart with a feeling of profound, absolute detachment. For 31 years, I had been the silent punching bag, the convenient scapegoat required to maintain their illusion of superiority. I had absorbed their insults, swallowed their dismissals, and quietly built the logistical infrastructure that kept their sinking ship afloat. They had assumed my silence was a symptom of weakness. They had believed my lack of protest was an admission of inferiority. They did not understand that silence is simply the sound of a predator evaluating its prey. I had not needed to raise my voice or throw a tantrum to destroy them. I had simply gathered the data, secured the leverage, and presented the undeniable truth. Their own greed, their own arrogant assumption that they could steal my brilliance without consequence, had provided the fuel for their destruction. I had merely handed them the match. The brawl on the stage began to slow, running out of oxygen. Richard leaned heavily against the podium, gasping for breath, his suit torn and disheveled. Vanessa remained on the floor, sobbing into her hands, the reality of her total, absolute ruin finally breaking her. They had nothing left to bargain with. They were entirely alone, isolated by their own toxic ambition. I turned my attention away from the pathetic display on the stage. The financial execution was complete. The social humiliation was absolute. But the purge was not yet finished. The corporate destruction had cleared the battlefield, preparing the ground for the final strike. The legal consequences of their actions, the crimes they had committed to secure the stolen patent, were still waiting to be served. I looked toward the main entrance of the atrium, ready to watch the final layer of their destruction arrive. The heavy glass doors of the OmniCorp atrium swung open with a forceful, synchronized motion. The chaotic murmurs of the press corps and the ragged breathing of the ruined executives on the stage were instantly silenced. The atmospheric pressure in the room shifted, pulled toward the imposing figures striding through the entrance. 3 men wearing stark conservative dark suits entered the hall. They did not wear security badges or corporate lanyards. They moved with the unmistakable coordinated precision of federal law enforcement. The crowd parted automatically, a silent, urgent wave clearing a direct path from the entrance to the stage. The lead agent, a tall man with close-cropped gray hair and an expression devoid of any human empathy, ascended the 3 short steps onto the platform. He reached into his breast pocket and produced a leather wallet, flipping it open to display a silver shield. Richard Kensington and Vanessa Kensington, the agent, announced, his voice carrying the flat, unyielding authority of the federal government. Richard, still leaning heavily against the mahogany podium, froze. The erratic, desperate energy that had fueled his brawl with Vanessa evaporated, replaced by a profound, paralyzing terror. Vanessa, weeping on the floor near the shredded contract, stopped sobbing, her eyes widening as she stared at the federal badge. The agent withdrew a folded document from his inner pocket and held it up. "I am executing federal arrest warrants for both of you," he stated, his words ringing out like hammer strikes in the quiet atrium. "You are being charged with extortion in the 2nd-degree interstate wire fraud and the production of fraudulent legal documents intended to secure a commercial transaction." The conflict hit its absolute apex. The financial ruin I had orchestrated was devastating, but the introduction of federal criminal charges altered the landscape entirely. This was no longer a corporate dispute over assets. This was the catastrophic terminal end of their freedom. The flashing cameras, which had briefly paused, erupted into a blinding frenzy. The press realized they were not just covering a failed merger or a family dispute. They were documenting the high-profile arrest of a prominent hospitality CEO and his heiress daughter on live television. Vanessa's husband, a man who had stood silently near the back of the VIP section throughout the ordeal, suddenly moved. He had enjoyed the benefits of the Kensington wealth, happily attending the galas and driving the luxury cars purchased with Richard's shadow debt. He had watched Vanessa humiliate me for years without uttering a word of objection. But witnessing the arrival of the FBI was a bridge too far. The self-preservation instincts of a corporate parasite kicked in immediately. He did not rush forward to comfort his wife. He did not ask the agents for clarification or demand to see the warrants. He simply turned on his heel and walked briskly toward the nearest exit, his head down, desperately trying to avoid the camera lenses. Vanessa saw him retreating. "Mark," she shrieked, the panic in her voice bordering on hysteria. "Mark, where are you going? Help me call our lawyers." Mark did not stop. He pushed through the heavy glass doors and disappeared into the Boston morning, abandoning his wife to the federal authorities without a single backward glance. The reality of her total isolation finally broke through Vanessa's delusion. She scrambled across the stage on her hands and knees, her ruined crimson dress tangling around her legs. She bypassed the FBI agents and crawled directly toward me, her hands reaching out desperately. "Clara, please." Vanessa sobbed, her fingers clawing at the fabric of my tailored trousers. "You have to tell them it was a misunderstanding. You have to tell them I didn't know about the extortion. You are my sister, Clara. We are family. You cannot let them send me to federal prison." She clung to my leg, weeping uncontrollably, performing the role of the terrified victim. It was the exact same tactic she had used her entire life to manipulate our parents to escape consequences, to shift the blame onto me. She truly believed that appealing to sibling loyalty would override the reality of her crimes. She believed that beneath my cold exterior, the quiet, obedient sister still existed, ready to sacrifice herself to save the golden child. I looked down at the woman kneeling at my feet. I remembered the searing heat of the coffee she had deliberately spilled on my chest less than 24 hours ago. I remembered the cruel, mocking smile on her face as she dismissed me as uneducated help in front of the OmniCorp executives. I remembered the cold, calculated way she had presented the video of my mother struggling to breathe, using it as leverage to steal my life's work. I did not feel a shred of pity. I did not feel a flicker of sibling obligation. I slowly leaned down. I did not pull away violently. I moved with deliberate, terrifying calm. I reached out and gripped her wrists, my fingers pressing firmly into her skin. I detached her hands from my trousers, peeling her fingers away one by one until her arms fell limply to her sides. I straightened up, looking directly into her tear-stained, panicked face. "You poured scalding coffee on me yesterday, Vanessa," I said, my voice low and completely devoid of warmth. "You smiled while doing it. You watched a video of our mother on a ventilator and used it to extort my signature." I took a slow step backward, creating physical distance between us. "Blood is merely a biological accident." I continued, ensuring my words carried the absolute finality of a judge delivering a sentence. "It is a shared genetic sequence. It is not a binding contract that requires me to absorb your abuse, and it is certainly not a pardon for your crimes. You made your choices. Now you will face the consequences." I turned my gaze away from my sister and looked directly at the lead FBI agent. I offered a short, definitive nod. The agent signaled to his partners. They stepped forward efficiently, pulling Vanessa to her feet and securing her hands behind her back with heavy steel handcuffs. They executed the same maneuver on Richard, who offered no resistance, his eyes vacant, staring blankly at the torn contract on the floor. The click of the handcuffs echoed through the silent atrium. They were escorted off the stage, marched down the center aisle, through the gauntlet of flashing cameras and staring executives. The CEO of Kensington Hospitality and his brilliant inventor daughter paraded out of the OmniCorp tower in disgrace, their empire dismantled, their freedom revoked. I watched them disappear through the glass doors. The financial execution had secured the assets. The legal execution had secured the justice. But the final strike, the complete neutralization of their leverage, was still unfolding in a hospital room across the city. I reached into my pocket, preparing to receive the confirmation that the final vulnerability had been permanently sealed. The federal agents gripped Richard by his upper arms, hauling him away from the podium. The steel handcuffs glinted sharply under the atrium lights. He moved stiffly, his expensive linen suit hanging awkwardly on his frame. As they marched him past the center aisle where I stood, Richard violently jerked his shoulder, momentarily halting the procession. He locked eyes with me. The profound shock that had paralyzed him moments ago morphed into a desperate, feral malice. He was a man being dragged to the gallows, desperately searching for one last stone to throw. He believed he still held the ultimate trump card. He believed he still controlled the one vulnerability that could break me. "You think you won, Clara." Richard sneered, his voice a hoarse, ragged bark that carried over the clicking cameras. He strained against the agent's grip, leaning toward me. "You send me to prison, your mother dies on that ventilator today." A collective gasp rippled through the press corps. The reporters, already documenting a historic corporate collapse, were now witnessing an overt, horrifying threat to a woman's life. Richard smiled, a grotesque, twisted stretching of his lips. "I am the sole signatory on the medical escrow account. I am the medical proxy. The moment I am processed, the payments stop. The hospital will pull the plug, and her death will be on your hands." He laughed, a short, barking sound, entirely convinced he had delivered a fatal psychological blow. He thought the threat of my mother's death would force me to beg to retract the allegations, to somehow halt the federal machinery I had set in motion. I did not break eye contact. I did not flinch. The cold, impenetrable calm that had shielded me throughout the morning solidified. I reached into the inner pocket of my charcoal blazer and retrieved my smartphone. I tapped the screen navigating to my active call log and pressed a single button. I activated the speakerphone function and held the device up between us, ensuring the volume was loud enough for Richard, the federal agents, and the nearest reporters to hear. "Dr. Evans," I said, my voice steady and clear. "Are you on the line?" "Yes, Miss Kensington," a crisp, professional voice echoed from the phone's speaker. It was the chief administrator of Boston General Hospital. "I am here. Could you please confirm the current status of my mother's account and medical proxy?" I asked, watching Richard's twisted smile begin to waver. "Certainly," the administrator replied, his tone radiating bureaucratic certainty. "We have verified the wire transfer initiated at 7 o'clock this morning. $1 million has been deposited into the hospital's secure trust by Apex Holdings, LLC. The funds have been permanently earmarked to cover all current and future surgical, rehabilitative, and long-term care expenses for Mrs. Kensington for the next 5 years." Richard stopped breathing. The color that had rushed to his face during his outburst drained away instantly, leaving him a sallow, sickly gray. Furthermore, the administrator continued delivering the final crushing detail. "Our legal department has processed the emergency guardianship petition filed by your attorney, David Hayes. Given the verified evidence of financial extortion and medical endangerment presented against the previous proxy, a federal judge has granted the immediate transfer of all medical decision-making authority. You are now the sole legal medical proxy for your mother, Miss Kensington." "Thank you, Dr. Evans," I said. "Please ensure the surgical team proceeds with the valve replacement immediately." "Of course. The team is scrubbing in now." I ended the call. The sharp beep of the disconnected line echoed in the quiet atrium. I lowered the phone and looked at my father. The man standing before me was entirely broken. The realization that his final, most cruel piece of leverage had been systematically neutralized shattered his reality. He had built his empire on control manipulation and the ruthless exploitation of weakness. Now stripped of his wealth, his status, his freedom, and his power to terrorize his own family, he was reduced to nothing. His face crumpled, a mask of profound, unadulterated despair. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly, his eyes darting frantically around the room, searching for an escape that did not exist. I took a slow step forward, closing the distance until I was mere inches from his face. The federal agents did not intervene, sensing the absolute finality of the moment. I leaned in, keeping my voice a low, lethal whisper, meant only for him. "You will never use my mother to extort me again, Richard." I stated the words carrying the weight of a stone sealing a tomb. "You have no money, you have no company, you have no family, and you have no leverage." I straightened my posture, looking down at him with an expression of pure, freezing indifference. "Good luck in federal prison." I offered a curt nod to the lead FBI agent. The agent gripped Richard's arm firmly and marched him toward the glass exit doors, shoving him out into the glaring morning sunlight. I stood in the center of the OmniCorp atrium, the chaos of the press corps swirling around me. I had successfully defended my intellectual property, secured my mother's life, and orchestrated the total legal annihilation of the people who sought to destroy me. The victory was absolute, but the restructuring of the Kensington Empire was just beginning. The predators had been removed from the board. Now it was time to claim the territory. The federal agents pushed Richard through the heavy glass doors of the OmniCorp tower and out onto the wide granite steps. The flashing lights of the police cruisers waiting at the curb cut through the morning glare. The press corps surged forward, a chaotic wave of microphones and cameras spilling out of the atrium to capture the final moments of the Kensington Empire. I followed closely behind David, moving with me, matching my stride. We did not stop to address the reporters. We walked directly toward the lead FBI vehicle, where an agent was currently holding the door open for Richard. Before Richard could be forced into the back seat, David accelerated his pace. He intercepted the procession, placing himself firmly between the ruined CEO and the waiting cruiser. The federal agents instinctively tightened their grip on Richard, but David held up his hand, projecting absolute legal authority. "One final administrative detail," David announced, his voice booming over the shouts of the journalists. David reached into his heavy leather briefcase. He bypassed the standard legal briefs and extracted a single rigid sheet of parchment paper bearing the raised seal of the Massachusetts Superior Court. It was not a warning. It was an execution order. He stepped directly into Richard's personal space. Richard recoiled, his eyes wide with a frantic, exhausted terror, realizing the onslaught was not yet over. "Mr. Kensington." David stated, his tone dropping an octave, resonating with cold, clinical precision. "This is an expedited deed of foreclosure, authorized by a federal judge at 8 o'clock this morning." With a swift, forceful motion, David slapped the document flat against Richard's chest. He pressed his palm against the paper, pinning it directly over the lapel of Richard's expensive ruined suit. "Because you failed to satisfy the $20 million commercial note held by Apex Holdings," David explained, ensuring every word was captured by the surrounding microphones. "The collateral securing that debt has been officially seized. The $10 million Kensington family estate in Weston is no longer your property. It currently belongs to Clara Kensington, acting as the sole managing director of Apex Holdings." Richard stared down at the paper pressed against his chest. His breathing became shallow, rapid gasps. The physical reality of losing his home, the ultimate symbol of his wealth and power, struck him with paralyzing force. Furthermore, David continued, twisting the blade. "The local sheriff department has been dispatched to the Weston estate. They are executing an immediate eviction protocol. You and any remaining occupants have exactly 48 hours to remove your personal effects." David leaned closer, his voice hardening into a lethal whisper meant for Richard's ears, but loud enough for the nearest cameras to catch. "If your belongings are not cleared from the premises by 9 o'clock on Wednesday morning, a designated clearing crew will physically remove every piece of furniture, every designer suit, and every piece of stolen artwork and dump them onto the sidewalk for public disposal." David stepped back, removing his hand, but the stiff parchment paper remained wedged against Richard's chest, held in place by the agent grip on his arms. "You are a bankrupt felon, Richard," David concluded, turning away from the ruined man. "And as of this morning, you are officially homeless." The press corps erupted into a frenzy. The image was perfectly devastating. Richard Kensington, the arrogant patriarch who had built his identity on luxury and exclusion, was being shoved into the back of a federal vehicle wearing handcuffs, with a foreclosure notice literally plastered to his chest. The camera shutters sounded like a swarm of locusts, capturing the absolute total destruction of his legacy. The agent pushed Richard down into the seat and slammed the door shut. The police cruiser pulled away from the curb, its sirens wailing, echoing off the glass towers of the financial district. I stood on the granite steps, watching the flashing lights disappear down the avenue. The man who had shoved me away from a birthday cake, who had stolen my intellectual property, and who had tried to sacrifice my mother's life to save his ego, was gone. He had walked into the OmniCorp tower believing he was an apex predator. He had been escorted out as a destitute prisoner. The execution was flawless. The financial trap had sprung perfectly. The legal consequences were locked in. The public humiliation was absolute. But the purge required one final physical action. The paperwork dictated a 48-hour eviction window, but I was not going to wait for the authorities to clear the property. I was going to oversee the dismantling of the Kensington estate personally. I turned to David, offering a sharp, definitive nod. The real work, the physical extraction of the poison, was about to begin. The 48 hours following the OmniCorp confrontation moved with the relentless speed of a demolition crew executing a controlled implosion. When you sever the financial arteries of a corrupt empire, the structure does not collapse gently. It crashes downward with violent, brutal momentum. I did not allow a single moment of hesitation. I authorized David to activate every legal and logistical protocol necessary to purge the Kensington legacy from the map. The following morning at precisely 8 o'clock, a convoy of heavy-duty moving trucks bearing the stark white logo of Apex Holdings rolled through the wrought iron gates of the Weston estate. They bypassed the manicured circular driveway and parked directly on the pristine front lawn, tearing deep, muddy grooves into the imported grass. I stood on the front steps, flanked by local sheriff deputies who were present to enforce the eviction order. I watched as a team of 20 professional movers swarmed the $10 million property. I did not instruct them to handle the items with care. I instructed them to be fast. The physical dismantling of the Kensington facade was swift and merciless. Workers hauled out imported Italian leather sofas, tossing them unceremoniously into the back of the idling trucks. They stripped the walls of Richard's carefully curated art collection, stacking the gilded frames haphazardly near the front door. The massive mahogany dining table, the site of countless arrogant family dinners, was dismantled and dragged down the steps. Vanessa, who had been released on bail late the previous night, stood on the front porch sobbing hysterically. She wore a stained designer tracksuit, clutching a handful of designer handbags as movers systematically emptied her expansive walk-in closet. She screamed demands at the workers, threatening lawsuits and demanding respect, but her voice was drowned out by the chaotic noise of the eviction. The spectacle drew an audience. High society neighbors, wealthy executives, and local politicians who had previously attended Richard lavish galas gathered near the perimeter fence. They watched in stunned silence as the aristocratic illusion of the Kensington family was packed into cardboard boxes and hauled away. The social exile was absolute. No one offered assistance. No one offered shelter. They simply observed the ruin, protecting their own reputations from the fallout. While the estate was being gutted, I ensured my mother was relocated with the utmost precision and care. A specialized private medical transport unit secured by Apex Holdings arrived at Boston General. Helen, still recovering from the successful emergency valve replacement, was carefully transferred from the standard intensive care unit. She was not returning to the toxic environment of the Weston estate. I had secured a long-term suite in a premier coastal rehabilitation facility overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. The room was bathed in natural light, staffed by dedicated cardiac specialists, and entirely funded by the liquid assets I had seized from Richard's operational accounts. She was safe, shielded from the legal chaos, and permanently insulated from my father's manipulation. Vanessa's husband, Mark, executed his own ruthless exit strategy. He recognized the sheer toxicity of the federal fraud indictment hanging over his wife. He did not attempt to mount a defense. He acted with the vicious self-preservation instinct of a corporate parasite. Within 24 hours of Vanessa's arrest, Mark filed emergency divorce proceedings. He utilized a team of aggressive family law attorneys to secure temporary full custody of their children, arguing that Vanessa's impending felony trial and sudden homelessness created an unstable and dangerous environment. He petitioned the court to freeze all joint marital assets, effectively locking Vanessa out of her own bank accounts. When Vanessa was finally forced off the Weston property by the sheriff deputies, she had nothing. She stood on the sidewalk outside the gates, holding 2 designer handbags and a single suitcase containing whatever clothes she could salvage. Her husband had abandoned her. Her father was in federal lockup. Her social circle had evaporated. The woman who had poured scalding coffee on my chest and mocked my intelligence was now destitute, standing in the mud, watching her empire get driven away in moving trucks. The corporate dismantling of Kensington hospitality proceeded with equal brutality. David, acting as the primary liquidator for Apex Holdings, initiated the immediate fire sale of the hotel portfolio. We did not attempt to salvage the brand. We stripped the assets, sold the prime real estate to aggressive competitor chains, and auctioned the remaining operational equipment to cover the outstanding liabilities. The $50 million conglomerate Richard had spent a lifetime building was carved up and sold for scrap in less than 2 days. The people who had stood around the birthday cake laughing as Richard shoved me into a glass table were now facing the crushing reality of their own arrogance. They were bankrupt, facing decades in federal prison, and entirely exiled from the elite circles they had worshipped. They had built their entire existence on a foundation of theft and manipulation, and I had simply pulled the linchpin. The 48 hours of destruction cleared the board completely, leaving behind nothing but the clean, scorched earth required to build something new. The morning air rolling off the Boston harbor carried the sharp, clean scent of salt and ozone. 30 days after the Kensington Empire dissolved into the sterile silence of a bankruptcy court, I stood at the threshold of a new era. The Apex Food Technology Innovation Center spanned 50,000 square feet of prime commercial real estate. It was a cathedral of glass and steel, housing the most advanced cryogenic research laboratories on the eastern seaboard. I did not inherit this sprawling complex. I built it from the ashes of the conglomerate I personally dismantled. Hundreds of industry professionals, international investors, and culinary pioneers gathered in the bright open-air atrium. The camera flashes illuminating the room were no longer documenting a corporate scandal or a high-profile federal arrest. They were capturing the birth of a global enterprise. I stood on the raised platform overlooking the assembled crowd. I wore a tailored ivory suit, a deliberate visual departure from the dark armor I utilized during the hostile takeover. The deep laceration on my lower back had healed into a thin silver scar, a permanent physical reminder of the price of admission. In the front row, shielded from the pressing throng, sat the people who earned their place in my life. Helen rested comfortably in a custom ergonomic wheelchair, holding a small, vibrant bouquet of white lilies. The sickly gray pallor of the intensive care unit was gone, replaced by the steady, healthy glow of a woman reclaiming her autonomy. She breathed easily without the aid of a mechanical ventilator, her eyes tracking the activity on the stage with profound maternal pride. David stood beside her, his hand resting protectively on the shoulder of his wife, Mia. Mia had distanced herself from the Kensington toxicity years ago, choosing quiet stability over the manic performance of our father. She watched the ceremony with tears welling in her eyes, holding her husband's hand tightly. They looked up at the platform, radiating genuine, unscripted admiration. They were the family I chose. They were the inner circle forged in loyalty and forged in truth. Standing directly to my right was Julian Rossi. The executive chef had traded his catering apron for a sharp charcoal blazer. He held a tall crystal flute of sparkling water, tilting it slightly toward me in a silent, respectful toast. He was no longer a hired contractor serving drinks to arrogant executives. He was the newly appointed Chief Culinary Director of Apex Innovations, overseeing the global implementation of the algorithms I authored. He understood the value of the raw code the day he dropped his carving knife at the Ritz-Carlton, and his unwavering loyalty was rewarded with substantial corporate equity. The event coordinator approached the podium and handed me a pair of heavy ceremonial shears. I gripped the ornate brass handles, feeling the cool metal against my palms. I looked out over the assembly of journalists and venture capitalists. I did not offer a lengthy, self-congratulatory speech. The towering facility humming with proprietary servers behind me served as a sufficient statement. I aligned the steel blades against the wide red ribbon stretching across the main laboratory doors. With one fluid, decisive motion, I snapped the handles together. The fabric fell away, fluttering to the polished granite floor. A wave of thunderous applause echoed off the soaring glass walls. The visual timeline slows down, capturing the cascading sunlight and the falling red ribbon. My internal monologue steps forward, addressing the silent audience watching the screen. There is a specific psychological pattern embedded within the architecture of a toxic family. Narcissistic parents and golden siblings operate under a chronic delusion of scarcity. They fundamentally believe that success, respect, and love are finite resources. When they see you building something real, when they recognize your inherent capability, it triggers a deep primal terror within their minds. They realize your raw talent exposes their own mediocrity. They will attempt to push you away from the table. They will shove you away from the birthday cake, demanding that you surrender your rightful share so they can consume the validation they desperately crave. They will use public humiliation, financial coercion, and emotional blackmail to enforce your subjugation. They expect you to fight for a crumb. They want you to beg for a sliver of recognition because your desperation feeds their fragile ego. Do not give them the satisfaction of a reaction. Do not weep over a stolen slice of cake. When the people who share your genetic code decide you are a threat to their artificial hierarchy, you must alter your strategy entirely. You must detach your emotions and analyze their vulnerabilities. You let them posture and perform for the crowd. You remain silent. You step back into the shadows. You walk out of the ballroom and you buy the entire bakery. While my father sits in a federal holding cell awaiting sentencing, and my sister navigates the grueling reality of a public defender and a cramped, subsidized apartment, I am negotiating international trade routes. The contrast is the purest form of justice. The scene transitions from the bustling atrium to the quiet altitude of my corner executive suite. The chaotic noise of the grand opening fades into a soft, ambient hum. I sit behind a sprawling, polished concrete desk. Through the panoramic windows, massive cargo ships navigate the harbor, preparing to export the preservation technology across international waters. A thick, leather-bound portfolio rests in the center of the desk. It is not a forged intellectual property release. It is not a coerced, non-disclosure agreement weaponized by a desperate father holding my mother hostage. It is a legitimate 10-year global supply contract with the largest agricultural distributor in Europe. The terms are dictated exclusively by my legal team. The monetary valuation exceeds anything Richard Kensington ever managed to leverage during his entire pathetic career. I reach for the gold fountain pen resting beside the portfolio. I do not hesitate. My hand does not shake. I press the nib against the heavy parchment paper and sign my name with smooth, unyielding strokes. Clara Kensington. The signature is not a ransom payment for my mother's survival. It is the final definitive stamp of ownership over my own destiny. I close the portfolio. The satisfying thud of the heavy cover echoes in the pristine office. The frame slowly zooms out, capturing the expansive high-tech empire operating flawlessly below. The screen fades into a deep, solid black. A single authoritative message resonates in the dark. Your value does not lie in the mouths of others. Your worth is not determined by the people who try to break you to build themselves up. If you have ever been pushed down by the people who were supposed to protect you, leave a comment below. Share your story. You are not alone. Hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications for Olivia Stories Revenge channel to hear more accounts of women who refuse to surrender and who never bow down. I will see you next time.